everyone. A few years ago I saw one of those sort of inspirational quote things. You see them happening on Facebook or whatever, on social media occasionally. Lovely picture, inspirational quote. And this particular one was from the actress Gwyneth Paltrow, and she said, "Religion is the cause of all of the problems in the world. It's what separates people. More people have died because of religious conflict than any other reason." That's quite a popular attitude, or at least it was at the time. I think these days it's less popular now to think in that kind of a way. I think religion, that just causes the problems. If only everyone was a bit more like me, someone who was enlightened and intelligent and didn't go round killing people for silly reasons and all of that kind of thing. If only everyone was a bit more like me. Not me, but in the Gwyneth Paltrow kind of sense, and that's the kind of thing that just happens all the time. That we want people we want someone to fix it. That at the moment there's Brexit is a big thing in the UK, and Boris Johnson's slogan, Prime Minister, is let's get Brexit done. And it's kind of like he's the one, he thinks, who's going to get it all sorted. That's his thing. Put your faith in me. I will get it done. I will get it sorted. Or you think about what's happening in America with Trump, MAGA, make America great again. And Trump is kind of saying, look, put your faith in me and I will make America great again. And it's just putting your faith in someone to accomplish everything that we want to accomplish. Religion, that just causes the problems. Put your faith in me, put your faith in people, in someone, and that will solve everything. Now, is that the right kind of way to be thinking? And this is what I think this next part of Judges is about. It's actually quite a long passage. It's from chapter 10 verse 6 through to chapter 12 verse 7, and I'm not going to read out the whole passage. Obviously, if you want to read it, then I'll put the link in the description below. Go down and you can have it read out to you, or you can read it online, or whatever you want to do. So I'm just going to sort of deal with it as we go through. But Judges, as we've seen, if you've seen any of the previous videos in Judges, it just keeps on getting worse. And that's what we're going to see again today. It actually gets worse, but today I think it takes even a little step beyond that. So Jepthah, he was a mighty warrior, it says. His father was Gilead, his mother was a prostitute. This is chapter 11 and verse 1. But what happens is that Jepthah is driven away by his family. The legitimate sons of his father, they realise that if they drive him away, then they'll get more of an inheritance. So they drive Jepthah away, and he's sort of excluded from them, and he kind of gathers around him a band of mercenaries, or people who are just scoundrels or whatever, and causes a bit of trouble. But then they kind of come back to him and they say, look, we're being oppressed by the Philistines, and we're being oppressed. We need, or no, it's actually the Ammonites. Actually, says we need you to help us to fight them. We need you to come and save us. And Jepthah, he says, well, why should I come and help you? And they say, oh, please. And eventually he does. But it's very similar to what we saw in the last video, isn't it? About how the Israelites treated God. Because the Israelites cried out to God for help, and God said, well, why should I help you? Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. And they eventually, when they had put away their gods, and when they repented, then God helped them, and God sent a deliverer. And this is just the way that they treat God, the way that they treat Jepthah. And I think it's really interesting, isn't it, how the way that they treat God is kind of echoed in the way that they treat Jepthah. And it's very often the way that those who believe and trust in, who follow Jesus, are treated like Jesus sometimes. That people, Jesus was rejected and his followers will be rejected. Not all the time, but sometimes it happens. And Jesus said, a servant is not above his master. He said, if I was treated this way, how much more will you be treated this way? And that is often the case. Christians should not expect to be treated well by the world. Unfortunately, that's the way of the world, to reject God and to treat his servants in the same way. So Jepthah, he does eventually come and help them. And so he sends messengers to the king to say, what do you have against me that you have attacked my country? He sends messengers to the Ammonite king. And the Ammonite king, he basically says, look, when Israel came out of Egypt, they took away my land. Now give it back peaceably. It's a bit of a land grab, really. Now this is something which probably makes more sense if you can see a map. And I'll try and find one actually to put up on the screen briefly. But this is where the Israelites came out of Egypt. They came from the north to the Promised Land. And they came in sort of from the east side. And the land which the Ammonite king is accusing them of having stolen is from the north, which is the Jabbok River, down to the south. That's the Arnon River. And that whole region was part of Israel at this point, but the Ammonite king is saying, look, you've taken it away from me and from my people, so give it back. And I hope that looking at a map will help kind of visualize what he is talking about. So Jepthah, he gives a reply, and he does this by writing a letter. I say that the pen is mightier than the sword. So I thought it was quite interesting actually of Jepthah. He's got this reputation as sort of a scoundrel, but he's actually quite well educated, and he knows the history of it. And so he writes them this letter, and he says, he makes a number of points actually. He says firstly that Israel defeated the Ammonites fair and square. He says in verse 21, the Lord gave Sihon and his whole army into Israel's hands, and they defeated them. And Israel took over all the land of the Amorites who lived in that country. So he said, look, we got it fair and square. We defeated them. God gave us the victory. You don't have any claim on that land because we conquered, we won it. That's the first thing that he says. The second thing is that he said the Lord has given it to us. He says the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out. What right do you have to take it over? Will you not take what your God Chemosh gives you? Say, look, God's given us this land. What has your God Chemosh given you? The third thing that he says that Balak, the king, didn't fight Israel. Verses 25. Are you any better than Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he ever quarrel with Israel or fight with them? So he's saying, look, Balak knew what was right. When the Israelites came out of Egypt, Balak the king, he was terrified of them, and he said, oh well, we better not fight against them because we're terrified of what God might do having brought the Israelites out of Egypt. So Balak didn't fight against the Israelites. He was the king of Moab at that time, which was in that same region as well. And then Jepthah says, for 300 years Israel occupied Heshbon and all these towns. Why didn't you retake them during that time? So Jepthah says, look, we've been here for 300 years. You've had ample opportunity to retake this land, but you haven't. Why is it now that you're coming and making trouble against us? And so he gives 4 good reasons why that land belongs to the Israelites, and why the Ammonites should just shove off and not try anything on, which is what they were doing really. And so of course this letter gets sent, and the king of Ammon, he doesn't listen, and he comes and wants to make war against them. So what Jepthah does, and it's interesting actually the way that the story in Judges focuses, because it doesn't really focus on what happens with the battle. It focuses on Jepthah, and Jepthah, he makes a vow. He says, if you give the Ammonites into my hands, Whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Pretty foolish vow to make, given what happens just in a moment's time. Jepthah, I think this translation of the Bible as well smooths it out a little bit. It's a bit more ambiguous in the Hebrew text, because Jepthah does sound like he's saying, I will sacrifice him. That he was even thinking of sacrificing a person rather than sacrificing an animal, which it kind of makes it sound like it could be an animal in this. Did Jepthah have a human sacrifice in mind even at this point? Well, who knows? But what happens is he defeats the Ammonites. He goes over and he devastated 20 towns, and it says Israel subdued Ammon, so they stopped making trouble, which is really good. But then when he comes back, he returns to his home, and who should come out to meet him but his daughter, his only child, his daughter. And he's very sad, of course he is, but he goes and fulfills the vow that he's made. He said, look, I've made a vow to the Lord which I can't break, and now I have to go through with this. So she has a couple of months to mourn with her friends in the hills, and then she herself comes back and Jepthah fulfills his vow. Now we know that child sacrifice is abominable to God. That God drove out the nations before Israel, and one of the reasons why he did that was because they sacrificed their children. So God is not happy with child sacrifice, and it's a terribly wrong thing to do. So why does Jepthah do it? And I think it just comes at the hints really at the idea that Jepthah had his own ideas, and that although he knows some of Israel's history, he doesn't really know what is right and wrong. He wants to worship and serve God in his way, not in God's way. He says, I'll sacrifice my daughter, God won't mind that. And actually God does, and didn't want him to do that. He didn't even have to keep his vow. And if you look in the law, and I won't turn to it at the moment, but there is provision in the book of Leviticus chapter 5 verses 4 to 6. If someone made a foolish vow, then and they become aware of it, then they don't have to go through with it. It was a sinful thing to do, but they can make a sacrifice for it, they can make atonement for it. They don't have to go through and carry out the foolish vow. And so Jepthah, he should have been aware of that, and he should have known that he didn't have to go through with it. But he did. And I think that just shows that he cared more about his own thoughts rather than really listening to what God thought. So Jepthah, he does this awful thing of sacrificing his daughter, but then the Ephraimite forces, they crossed over, and this is at chapter 12 verse 1. They say, to Jepthah, why did you go out to fight the Ammonites without calling us to go with you? We're going to burn your house over your head. Well, the Ephraimites had form on this, and that's basically what they said to Gideon back in chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. Only that time, Gideon, he was a diplomat. He dealt with them more diplomatically, and he calmed them down and pacified them. But this time there was no such luck for the Ephraimites, and Jepthah, he responds with violence, and it ends up with them fighting and defeating them, and it says even 42,000 Ephraimites were killed at that time. And interestingly, this story is the origin of the word shibboleth, if you're familiar with that sort of word, and this is where it comes from in the Bible, but I'll let you read out why that should be. And so this, by the end of the story, Jepthah has defeated the Ammonites, but victory is looking a lot like defeat, isn't it? That actually they've got the victory over their enemies, but the enemy from within is even worse, that Jepthah sacrificed his daughter, that they killed 40,000 of their own people. That is where victory looks pretty hollow. I think it's what they sometimes call a Pyrrhic victory. It comes at such a cost. But only this time the problem is not their enemy, but themselves. The greater enemy is within them, not the external enemy. And that's the thing that happens here. It reminds me a bit of, that sometimes you read through the history of the 20th century, you think of these regimes, communist regimes, who tried to create a sort of utopia, but ended up killing millions of people in doing so. And it's a bit like that here, isn't it? Trying to create utopia, but doing it along the way, actually making a far greater problem. And that is a very human problem. It's what human beings are like. And ultimately that's because the problem is our enemy is not out there, but actually our greatest enemy is in here. Our greatest enemy is in our hearts, in our minds. And that enemy is sin. And we need someone who is going to be greater in order to save us from that. Because every human being suffers from that same problem. And if we put our faith in a human being, then it won't solve our deepest need, our greatest problem. And it's interesting how Jepthah, he was like Jesus in some respects. He was. There's a verse in the Bible which says, "The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone," and that's describing Jesus. And it's interesting how Jepthah was rejected because he was, his brothers didn't want him; they rejected him. And it's a bit like Jesus, that he was rejected by mankind. They put him on a cross, but he was the one that God chose to bring salvation. So Jepthah was a bit like Jesus in some respects, but he was also very unlike Jesus, because he still suffered from this same problem of the human heart, of the corruption of sin. Whereas Jesus didn't suffer from that. And Jesus is the one who actually came to defeat sin, who came to bring about, who came to die on the cross to bring forgiveness and to bring change and healing and transformation, something which couldn't happen through anyone else. Through only Jesus can make that happen. And this is the thing that, our problem, our deepest problem, is not at the external enemies that we face, but ourselves and our own sin. And Jesus is the only solution to that. So I think as we come to a close, I think the lesson to learn there is to remember that our sin is our deepest problem, and that we don't have the solution to that. Whatever external things may be going on, that we need to look to Jesus to heal us from our deepest need, and only then can those other things be dealt with. And that I think it's good as well to remember, and we saw this a couple of weeks ago with Gideon as well, but that we mustn't put too much faith in human leaders or in human plans, because at the end of the day they are flawed as well. Any solution which doesn't look to God or doesn't look to Jesus as the number one is doomed to failure in the long run, because God is the one who enables victory to happen, and God is the one who can deal with even the deeper problems than our kind of surface things. And I think that's the same no matter how big or small the problem. Right from something like climate change, I think we need to be looking to God for that rather than political solutions, through to things happening in our personal lives. We need to look to God and trust Him and walk with Him to solve our problems and to help us, not to looking to kind of come up with a human solution, but avoid talking to Him. So that's the thing. We need to look to God and we need to trust Him in everything. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please do click the like button, the thumbs up down below if you enjoyed it, and please do hit the subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this, and hit the bell, the notification button if you want to sort of get an email when I do a new video, as I know otherwise YouTube might not notify you that I put a new one on. So thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you again for another video very soon. God bless.